perform a hands-on usability test. So just by a show of hands, how many folks are familiar with usability testing? Have you actually conducted a test before? Okay. Good audience then. All right, great. So what exactly is a usability test, and what are the benefits? Those are going to be some of the things that we answer today for you. Why it makes sense to use them, some of the drawbacks and benefits, and ultimate takeaways for your team. So just a little bit about myself first. Why you should be listening to me up here. I've actually been in the field of usability for quite a long time. I started my foray into the industry with accessibility. Early on in my career as a developer, a full stack developer, maybe 10 years ago, I had pretty much built in every type of website and database that you can encounter, and I ended up overlooking accessibility in general. Nobody had ever taught me that in college, so it was something I was never exposed to. So in working in healthcare and municipalities and government, I ended up finding out about that firsthand, which was definitely an interesting experience, but an enlightening one as well, because at the time, I just, how did I miss this, is what the feeling really was. So as time progressed, I actually kind of developed the same kind of passion that I originally started with accessibility for usability as well. I'm actually from New York. I work for the government there, New York State, and I was probably one of the first in the area to get started on creating like a collaborative environment for all the user experience designers that were out there. And it was hard to come by. Maybe 2006 would be the time frame that we're speaking to. So at the time, UX wasn't a buzzword then. You would just kind of stumble upon it as you're trying to figure out what's wrong with your code or your design. So we actually got together, a few of us from GE, from, let's see, Autotask, and from healthcare and government, and we formed this usability group called the Albany UX. And this group, what we focused on was kind of getting that information out there and helping people to learn how to use it, which was a really exciting experience for me. So that's kind of why I got into this. So getting back to the topic here, usability testing. It's a bit more involved than just validating product requirements. Usability testing involves watching how people interact and how they actually think it should be used, not how your developers do. With that said, I'm sure that you've had a few projects out there that were led by stakeholders and their idea of what the design should look like and what it should be, only to find out after spending extensive hours developing it that there was really no correlation in what the end users wanted with what their vision may have been. So testing gives you great feedback on how people actually use the product versus what it was designed for. It's an opportunity to realign your development as you're going through the process so that you can save cost and actually not have to reinvent the wheel. It's an iterative process. It's something that you'll want to do as you come up with components or design concepts. It's something that should be probably involved in your sprints, if that's every 2 weeks or what have you. When you're coming up with that new component for your website, it's a good time to test it after you have the baseline wireframing together. You don't necessarily need an actual website to test a component for usability. Those simple tests early on in your process can save you a lot of grief in the end. Reworking components, starting from scratch, realigning visions, and saving you some difficult discussions versus with what people would want versus what they need. And again, there's nothing quite like real-world testing with a user. Okay, sorry, got out of place there. So, This is like a methodology. You have to start with a plan on how you're going to approach usability testing. And there's really three basic stages. You come up with tasks of how you're going to test your users, what you need to learn about that component that you're building or the function of your website, whether it be navigation, a form that you've created, or what have you. The test sessions themselves, they're a little bit involved. You have to think through how you're going to handle that, pre-screening, making sure that the users that you've selected meet the criteria that you need. For example, if you were on a shopping website, you wouldn't want somebody that, for example, spoke a different language. It wouldn't work out very well for them. So you want something that aligns with your target goals of your product or your website. And finally, the post-session analysis and reporting. That's the point where you can reflect on what your findings are and bring that to the stakeholders, to the developers, and allow your team to reflect and save yourselves a bit of work in the end. All right. So that first step that we talked about, it kind of involves gathering these participants and seeing who it is that is your audience. That can be derived from several things, your analytics, metrics. For healthcare, for example, you'll know that that's for patients. For government work, that would be for constituents and citizens of the state. For shopping website, shoppers. A good takeaway about gathering your participants is that you only need a few. There's not a lot more that you'll learn from testing 20 users. 5 should be enough, because in that scope, 80% of the issues with a website or a product will come to light, and you'll see similarities in their use. As I mentioned earlier, you want to run small studies. You don't want to take on the entire website. You want to focus on a component per se, maybe the navigation elements, and just test that so that you know what you're testing and what the scope is. You don't want to have, maybe the content of the website bias the user. And while I'm on the topic, finding these users, it's not all that difficult. In the industry, they have something referred to as hallway testing. And if you're in your preliminary stages, you can actually grab colleagues that are walking by the hallway. Maybe you have a team out front. You can conduct a test with them. Say, what are your thoughts on this? Be it so that they're completely removed from the process. They have no idea what you're asking, but that makes them a good candidate because they're not going to have a bias or an influence. It's going to be a natural reaction from that user. Earlier I mentioned screening questions. You want to weed out users who are not ideal. Maybe conduct a survey, or like a survey monkey, a testing. You could interview these users to see if they meet your criteria. And again, you want to make sure that you get that correct criteria for what your intended user and audience was. You don't want to test like a different age demographic from what your users actually will be. Okay, so you've got your users together. The next step would probably be knowing what to ask them. Asking users direct questions isn't really effective because it could be leading, it could be biased. Your questions actually provide a little bit of your opinion in them. You want questions that are more natural, more generic, things that say to the user something that has no basis to stand from. So for example, maybe you like one product versus the other. You want to make sure that your question isn't going to be biased for one to the other. If you leave a user to kind of explain something themselves, they end up explaining it much more naturally versus leading them with questions. You can often get much better results from your testing steps just by simply letting them kind of steer and letting them behind the wheel. A good practice is letting your users think out loud. And from that, just observe. You don't have to have a leading question at all. You could just see what their thoughts are. And that'll provide you with that natural response that you're looking for. Let me see. When you ask a direct question, people visualize the question and they think about it. It's not like a knee-jerk reaction. You want something that's going to be intuitive, something that is their genuine response to your design. If you have a question that says something like, for example, what do you think of this color? You're adding a bias for what their thoughts are on a color. Whereas if you were to say, what do you think of this design? They would comment on the color. So the questions that you ask can definitely have a little impact on the results. So the next step would be coming up with a task list, the directions that you give that user for how they're going to conduct this test. Typically, you want to set up an environment that meets the needs that you're asking for. So, for example, maybe you're testing for a certain demographic, a certain browser, a certain operating system. These are all things that can be a component of that environment that you set up for the test. Let's see. When you're setting up a task list, if you have different moderators that are conducting these tests, maybe you're having different designers conduct a test, their questions might be different. If you set up a consistent plan for what the question should be, you'll add that consistency to all your results as well. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of interactions with your participants because for the most part, you'll kind of know what to expect after the first or second one. You'll understand what area pain points they might have, and you can kind of foresee that and know how to respond. This task list should be very simple, should be clear and to the point. It shouldn't be in a very development-centric tone. You're going to want to use phrases and terms that are user-friendly. You want something that they're going to respond to. So if there were directions for microwaving something, you'd probably want to align with that versus speaking to them about the interface and the div and HTML markups. And finally, let's see, moderating a session. This is you as the designer stepping in and taking a look at how these users are responding. If it's your first time moderating a session, it's actually very difficult. You wouldn't necessarily think it is, but it requires patience, empathy, being professional, building a relationship and trust with that user so they don't think that you're maybe cynical or you're not driving them down a using path. For example, a certain way to use the navigation. Well, maybe you should use it this way. There's a lot involved with catching yourself before you ask those questions. Knowing so much about the product kind of limits you. You want to take it from their perspective. You want them to teach you how they're going to use that product. You want to learn from their experience. As I mentioned earlier, you want to stay away from leading questions and always make sure that you have an unbiased tone. So just genuine intrigue with a response that a user might have. After that is kind of the wrap-up, analyzing and reviewing your results of those test sessions that you conduct. Going through your notes, maybe making sure that your notes are clear. Oftentimes things could get muddled as you're jotting things down, trying to keep pace with your participant or user. Maybe you have thoughts along the way of how you could correct or improve that process or product. These are things that you can jot down as well. And the other component is actually doing it as soon as possible because it's important to make sure that you're in the right state of mind when you're evaluating all of this. If you wait too long, you might come up with your own conclusions as to their reactions of maybe how you would have thought about that versus how they did. So it's good to solution this and make sure that you're keeping it within the scope of the user's perspective. All right, so with that, we're going to get into a little bit of testing here. So I don't know if you guys can pair up, possibly. Ideally, we'd want just a small group. It could be an observer, a moderator, and a participant. The participant is going to be that user, that person that's testing things out. The moderator is going to be your designer, your developer, that's going to be asking the questions. And we'll actually go through one of these processes for you. If you can't pair up with somebody, definitely feel free to just ask me, and I could go through an interaction on the screen for you. Okay. All right, so the site that we're going to be testing is actually Target.
If we have odd numbers, should we have one group of three?
Yeah, you could do a group of three. Maybe someone could serve as an observer's role. That's an experience, and it's something you'll take away when you get back to your office. Okay, so if everyone could go to Target's website if you have a laptop. Otherwise, definitely you can interact with me up here on the screen. That'll work too. And we're going to actually follow through a task list. Now, mind you, in your own environment, you'll have developed this task list yourself, but I'll give you a peek as to the concept and the mindset behind the workings of that as we go here. So, let's see. Up on the screen, you see a task list. I came up with this a little bit earlier, but go ahead and read through it and think about what it says. Note the tone, the wording of the question, and notice that it has like a focus of what you want that user to do. It doesn't tell you how to do it. It's simply asking you to do it. With that said, you will get a genuine response from that user. They're not going to know to use the navigation. They might not know that the search box exists. So when you're coming up with your task list, these are things to think of. Definitely being unbiased, but giving them a focus of what you want them to do. What is the intended purpose of this website, of this component? And that'll actually be what you derive and create your task list based off of. So you could go ahead and read that and follow along the steps. One person will be the user or participant, the other the moderator or observer. What you're going to want to do is take notes on how that person interacts. It'll definitely be interesting because you have to elicit questions. Maybe they don't know where to start, for example.
Well, let me just say this to everybody. I've used this site a lot, and so I'm already familiar with navigating it. So would I not have been selected for this testing?
That's a perfect example. Your screening process would have eliminated that user early on. So as you're gathering those users, you want to make sure that they meet that criteria. We want an unbiased review of this website. So those are the questions to ask. So everyone who's a Target website user, you know, you're out. Okay, so you two can switch roles. Go ahead and read that task, Liz, and follow through those steps. The one person who is the moderator or observer, you're watching the screen for their interactions, maybe where they're moving that mouse cursor, and asking them their thoughts as they do it. So you're going to want to solicit feedback from them. A good way to do that would be, for example, tell me what your first step would be in completing this task. Note that that question is completely unbiased, has no direction to it, and can't lead or direct a user in one way or another. So, has everybody kind of absorbed the task list?
Yeah, there's a little bit of stuff at the very top. Looks like they're sort of trying to tap.
Okay, so everyone has the task. You understand the task, right? The next slide, we're going to actually look at what the observer or moderator should be thinking.
This thing's like highlights, maybe registration. I'm surprised that that's its own full thing. I guess my last stuff for babies. I've got a greater survivor after
Can you go back to?
Yeah, definitely.
Usually when you scroll through the whole page, like
Right,
just,
we usually select out what you're looking for or something that you
all right.
One of your family members is planning a camp trip, and you want to find a suitable gift for them, and put it in your shopping cart.
Okay.
So how would you go about navigating to that task?
So I might first scroll through and see if anything seems to go from this side. I agree with what you did today. Relative to what? More than my mother
In
does.
person?
Water bottles and stuff like that, those are sort of, those just, let me try the search box at the top. Tent. Here's a whole category. Just like and someone in my family are going camping,
Yeah, anyone.
so probably never have an tent.
Yeah, maybe something just kind of fun and useful that they I just noticed that there's some, yeah, right, for because you just always do stuff I wouldn't do. Because I would, like, I would have just, I think I would have looked for categories first and tried to navigate by category. I don't know, like, recommending. I think I probably would have done that, but.
Great, so what was the
Accessories, it just shows me tent.
I'm not supposed to be helpful, I'm just
Yeah.
unbiased.
In terms of.
I really like the
To help with that, you could be helpful in a probing manner. What do you think would be useful?
Basically, the tent.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not really.
Wait, so
Yeah, that's what we had.
tense.
There's reason in tennis.
So you
Like this little suitcase, because it was like a panda bear, and the little girl had it, and I like it. It was also a scooter, so she could like go through the airport with her on a scooter, saving her energy, still having her like all her stuff. Like she was like happy and having fun, and her parents were like, they were all like, oh gosh, our kid's not acting on their own scooter.
Okay, guys, we're wrapping about 2 more minutes, so make sure you're collecting your feedback, your notes.
It's dangerous, but or
definitely found this so that you know
You can put in those straws where they get your head
it's like it sounds and like how quickly you do it.
All right, guys, so why don't we go ahead and wrap up now? So now let's take an opportunity to go through each one of the individual groups here and talk about your findings. What was your experience as both the user and the moderator? You guys want to start first? What were your thoughts like as to the process? You felt it was insightful? You could wear either your designer, your developer, or your user's hat in the feedback here.
I think that he was a little too leading. She had her own ideas about how to use the site, rather than just letting me flounder. And I guess that comes back to.
Time limit. I didn't want to feel the test.
I guess that comes back to what you said earlier, that one of the things we need is patience.
There's definitely a lot that goes into that, though. But, so you see now, as I was explaining, that this could definitely be a difficult process to learn. So good thing that your first time is happening here. As the observer, what were your thoughts on your user?
He wasn't fast enough. He couldn't figure out his site. He couldn't put anything in his cart. He couldn't make decisions.
Okay, no, but this is a good opportunity to probe and gather more information and feedback. Okay, why wasn't he fast enough? What impeded his navigation? This is the core of what usability is about, understanding those little subtleties and picking up on them. Great job, guys. You folks want to go next?
So I feel that I almost achieved my goal too quickly and too efficiently, that it didn't give the moderator enough to ask about.
So I suppose, like, as a moderator, then what I took it was like, okay, he clearly like found exactly what he wanted like right away. So I took it from the perspective of like target, which is like, okay, how do I cross sell to this person? Like, you know, like, and I also asked questions as to like why there are different like user journeys he could have taken, and so I sort of like asked him, did he consider those alternate paths and why he did jump to that, and then like he used he went like straight to the search bar instead of the drop-down categorization. But I also noticed he didn't like pause to see the predictive text drop-down that came, which like really quickly I noticed like it's kind of cool that it's got like these indented options, which I've never seen before. But anyway, he like didn't even wait. He get returned, so I sort of like asked him if he had seen it and like would he think that was useful, and that's sort of where I went with it.
So that's a very telling test right there. I mean, maybe there was a component that was built that's never going to be utilized. These are all great opportunities for learning how people use your product. She had mentioned journey mapping and personas. What those are is the demographics of your user. A persona is what identifies that user. What are you looking for? Is it, middle class income family from, Wisconsin, what have you? Gather all those demographics, how you visualize this person in your mind, and that's how you come up with a persona. The journey mapping, that's the path that they use to get what they're attempting to obtain. For example, how did you get to that shopping cart? Did you first click the menu? Did you click the shopping cart icon? There's several ways that you can approach that. All right, great job, guys. How about you guys in the back?
I was the moderator watching her surf through the site, and when she first went to the site, she realized it was a sales-oriented site, product-oriented, and e-commerce, which verbally told me what the site was and was good. When she navigated to search for the camping gear, she went to the categories first, and the drop-down and search for camping, and didn't use the search box was the first thing they noticed. She found sleeping bags, she scrolled through the different types, then she realized she was buying it for her dad who wanted high quality. You wanted quality over price. So she clicked on the ratings, the 4 stars and 5 stars, and searched that, finally figured out which one she wanted, and then added it to the cart. And then she actually did the search feature to see if there's any other camping related gear that didn't show up in the camping categories. And she did that. It was the same stuff, and she didn't want to use a credit card to buy the sleeping bag. And what she did both categories in search, which I thought was interesting. And it may be that we are in this group here right now, maybe a little bit more tech savvy in knowing that this is targeted, and we can sort of show all the examples. But I'm thinking back to my office and my team, and probably with Target, they probably spent tons of man hours developing this category drop-down thing that I probably never would have used if it was me. And half my team wouldn't use it. They would just go to the search box and type in, and use that useless tool there. But she went to it first, and maybe that's her preferred mechanism of going there. And as you said, how you get to the shopping cart, you can click on the little cart icon, do it in your, as you subtotal in your products. There's a bunch of ways to get to it. And each of us have a different method of going to that. And so if you provide more avenues for them to get to the shopping cart, it's better for probably Target. If you provide more avenues to find the products that you need, it's going to be more useful for Target as well.
And you make a great point, which maybe through the millions of dollars that Target has spent on their user testing, those personas were giving them direction. And the test, the usability test that they were conducting, was giving them direction that users, different personas, different types of users, use the website a different way. Maybe someone is a little more analytical, more thorough, versus somebody just wants to get right to the point. So they're satisfying their multiple demographics, but that all is derived from user testing. So great points. And you guys in the back, how was your experience?
It went pretty smoothly. I was the observer, so she had a clear idea of what she was looking for, so she went straight to the search box and entered her search terms. And then promptly went to the facets on the left, so that was also a good indication that somebody was using them, so that they found them helpful. And I asked a few questions about how she evaluates products, like do you read reviews, do you find those helpful, and so then she found a few items and was debating on, meeting the minimum price requirements for the free shipping. So that was definitely something that was taken into consideration, so good to know. And otherwise, yeah, it seemed like a pretty smooth purchase process.
Very good. Any thoughts from the user perspective?
Yeah, at one point, when I first went to search in the search box, I just kind of reiterated what I did. It's like, so you go to the search box to search. And then I just started kind of talking through what I was doing more instead of just keeping it in my head. So that was good.
Yeah, and that's a good point to make. You as the observer, you have to elicit that information from them. It's a task that's learned with time, definitely, because your users, as you can imagine, are definitely all over the spectrum. But really good stuff. Typically in a more elaborate testing where you've already set the stage for what results you're looking for. Here we are. Easy. Okay, notes are probably hugely important because when I mentioned that before, you want to capture that user's perspective. Maybe tomorrow morning when you review it won't be the same as this afternoon. You'll fill in some of those thoughts for the user yourself as a developer or designer. So you definitely want to make a point to capture that as soon as you walk away from this test. And again, all this information that you gather is huge because think of those questions came up in the sprint cycle or the development of that component that you're using. So, for example, what if they don't use this search component that we're developing right now at all? Typically not something your developers would want to hear, but things that come up, definitely. So, all right. That was all that I had, actually. So I just wanted to put the floor to you guys. Do you have any questions, maybe concerns, something to gather a little more information on? General UX questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So you have all this usability testing. What is sort of like your deliverable at the end? Like how do you aggregate all of what you have found?
So there's a few ways you can approach that. Typically, as we mentioned earlier here, you'll want to test more than one individual. So that'll create a spectrum of results for you. And no different than if you were looking at your Google Analytics, you want to culminate and see where there's consistencies, where there's something unique. And typically in the realm of like development cycles, that ends up in like an end user report, like a stakeholder report, something that's going to be that executive summary justifying why that stakeholder had a bad idea. But it's justifying why your design works, why your design is successful. You can go into a room and, dictate any kind of design. Here you have metrics to support all of that. So culminating all of those results from your test to substantiate the design, that's kind of the key to all of that. And just a little concise report for anybody to consume, because think of those folks that would be asking those questions. Any other questions?
And I suppose it's also helpful to have 5 users using the prototype based on what the stakeholder said we should do, and another 5 users experimenting with the prototype based on the way we think it should be implemented.
You would think so, but I would beg to differ.
Oh.
Because you want to test before you actually get into that prototype. So if you have built the entire website, you want to test as you're coming up with the individual components, not with the end results, but just as you're following along with your development process. Does that make sense?
But I said prototype.
Oh, so,
I didn't say finished website.
all right, like, I'm trying to like,
Well, that's my question.
the website might be too big in scope is what I'm getting at, you see? Like maybe you want to test functionality. You don't want to test the entire thing because in that, you can, the testing results kind of become ambiguous. They're not focusing on just the use of that search bar now. Now they're looking at your navigation, they're looking at how your, if you have a slideshow, which you shouldn't, but if you do, how that interacts. So you get like, they get lost in the woods, those users. So as you're developing this is really when you want to test it. So right in the heels of your development cycle. So maybe you're building a module or a view in your Drupal website. You want to test that just as soon as you're coming up with it, not when it's all culminated together, so that you can really genuinely test that element individually. It's a lot, but that saves you duplicative work. So if you built that entire website.
I didn't say build the entire
Okay,
website.
no.
I said a prototype. So there's one feature.
One feature.
And the product owner says, oh, I want 500 filters all exposed before the list of items at the bottom. And I say, well, wouldn't you want to collect some of them? And product owner says, oh, no, I know my users. That's the point where I take that one page, without any Chrome, without any search bar, just the filters and the list, and I implement it the way the product owner wants me to do it, and then I implement it the way I think it should be done. And I have one group of 5 users test one, and one group of 5 users test the other.
Okay, so validating your test, right? So you want to demonstrate that one process works and one doesn't.
Yes.
In a situation like that, what you want to do is actually build the design that with, kind of a minimum viable product, prototype, like you said. Maybe not even look into the development of it. Mock it up on a piece of paper. And then pursue your users from that. How would you interact with this pagination, for example? Or, how would you interact with this filter? You can actually save yourself a lot of work because you'll have nipped that in the bud right before it even got built. So now you have justification to build it the way that you intended, the way that you understand is right, that is reflective of what your users need, not solely based on the inflection of a product owner. But now that you have that user testing involved, you can justify not even going down that road of developing that filter functionality. And you can pursue what it would need to be, if that makes sense. So just as soon as you can and as often as you can, the usability testing is huge. And getting those users is more easy than you'd imagine. You can grab them as they're walking off the elevator. Doesn't matter. So you had a question, yeah?
So what is it that you actually give a user to test typically? Is there a certain level of fidelity or level of completion that's ideal, or do you see a range of it? Because I'm a designer, we produce wireframes, mock-ups. I don't make code that people can click on things. I mean, we have certainly ways to simulate that, but what is it that you see users testing actually to get good enough results, so kind of like the minimum viable thing to send to user testing before too much development's done?
So as a designer, you're probably familiar with Balsamic versus, let's say, Sketch or Adobe XD, for example. You have high fidelity and low fidelity, like wireframing versus like an actual mock-up of this website. The difference would be how much you need the user to understand that. So if your justification is going to go beyond just a simple component of an argument of how the filter should be designed, maybe it's a conceptual approach. That's where you might want more fidelity to give that user more information on what they're working with versus like a low fidelity is just for the quick and dirty during your development cycle. So that's kind of the difference in the fidelity. You had a question as well?
Yeah, I guess from a marketing point of view, like if marketing department comes to you and says they want to, increase the number of form submissions or something like that, but it's actually from the audience perspective, to get to that point requires a lot of like self-identification and filtering, and they might be passing through 4 or 5 gates to get to that form. Like, how would you recommend usability testing for that problem? Incrementally, as you were just previously describing, or like you're coming up with tests for each of like the filtering stages, or holistically for the whole thing, or ideally both?
I would probably say you're looking for the goal, right? That's what marketing has given you directives to achieve. So it would probably be in the user journey, how they got there. And maybe there's points where we can make this trip a little bit shorter, less clicks, but you need the whole picture available to do that. So you need to really understand your journey map and the goals of that marketing department. So, you know, if they're looking to get a certain ad or information to that user at this stage in the process, that would probably be when you could be a little more finite and detailed. You'll look closer at that component, but you do need the entire picture for them to navigate and understand. So that would be how you see that the user is interpreting that, and kind of discerning how you could inject that pop-up or whatever have you into that process without inflicting too much of distracting in that journey mapping that they have. So, but yes, you would need probably the scope of it to complete.
So hypothetically, suppose that marketing department wants us to get to this page, and it involves filling out a CAPTCHA and telling them my name and my favorite color, each on a separate page. Silly example, but would it be better to have people go through all those stages and see how often it takes? And if so, would 5 people still be enough? Or should I have separate groups where I have one group at the start and see whether they get past the first gate, and then the second group and say, do this to get past the first gate, and then see how well they do on the second gate, and have a third group test the third gate?
Actually, you make a great point, which is iterative testing. So after those 5 users, maybe 2 of them disappear when they hit that CAPTCHA. They're like, oh, no way, I clicked enough street signs or what have you. So that could give you a little more insight as to the component that you need to test now. So now instead of the journey map that you're testing, now you're testing that CAPTCHA component and how that user interacts. So from the large scope down to the smaller, from broad to more finite testing. But it just is iterative though. But it just justifies the way that you design it. If the users are completely opposed to that CAPTCHA, then, you know, that brings up the point of whether or not we actually use that now. I mean, there's obviously the spam prevention or what have you for the form, but is the trade-off there for the users that you lose versus the weeding out the spam? Maybe there's something like the honeypot module in Drupal that you can use to isolate. Maybe there's a different approach, I guess is what I'm saying. But kind of funneling that down is how you get to the solution for that. And it, you know, it invokes questions that you wouldn't necessarily ask. For example, like, why are we even using it? You know? That wouldn't come up if it's a focused CAPTCHA meeting that you're having for that development cycle. All right, guys. Well, it's a little bit past 5:20. I didn't mean to keep you late, but just don't be that guy, I suppose.